Hi, everyone. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that CU Boulder sits upon land within the occupied territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations, and that this research took place within social, political, and institutional structures, including the university, which serve to maintain white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalist extractivism. So my research investigated regional Indigenous relationships with the natural world. Previous literature on this relationship regards diverse Indigenous cultures as a homogenous whole. Here, differences in diversity might be recognized, but not functionally applied when conducting research. This is problematic because it's dehumanizing, erases Native voices, ignores lived experience, and reinforces destruction. Assuming homogeneity ignores the complex reality and diverse lived histories of Native people, silences those that connect differently with the natural world, and prevents researchers from understanding how the relationship to the natural world interacts with local pressures and cultures. Therefore, future literature must regard Indigenous communities as the diverse and complex nations that they are. Therefore, the goal of this study was to identify aspects of this previous literature at the regional level, as well as to challenge the assumptions of prior literature by comparing application of these aspects across regions. So, previous literature, while it certainly has its faults, has identified some key aspects of the Indigenous relationship to the natural world, which I will describe here as though they are homogenous, simply to summarize them. First, we have relationality, and the key here is kinship, the belief that all natural elements are beings, including plants, animals, water, and land, and that these beings are the relations of humans. Therefore, humans are just one element in a universe of sentient beings, creating a sense of mutual respect. Next, we have reciprocity. And the key here is a cycle of gift giving and interdependency. Here, reciprocal relationships reinforce kinship and create a sense of human responsibility, as humans are seen as stewards and caretakers of the natural world. Lastly, place remains an extremely important aspect of Native identity and sovereignty. Native societies store generations of ecological knowledge and practice, as well as the sense of embodied living, which is when the act of dwelling creates meaning, and cultural knowledge is stored in the land itself. So, to investigate regional similarities and differences in these aspects, I compared two regions with different historical cultures and modern environmental pressures. So in theory, different lived experiences. First, I looked at the Pacific Northwest coast. These nations traditionally relied on seafood and the ocean, built large permanent villages with strict social structures, and today are still fighting for treaty rights to fish and whale as climate change and overfishing threaten their way of life. I also investigated the plains, which is the region between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. Tribes in this region were historically nomadic and relying on buffalo herds, though these herds were nearly exterminated in the 1800s. This region is heavily impacted by relocation and reservation policies, and today these nations are facing battles over land treaties and encroachment of oil and gas on historic or sacred land. So I investigated two sources. First, tribal news, to measure depictions of current events. And then I also looked at legends, as storytelling is used to provide a cultural template in Native societies to this day. Neither of these sources were ideal, but they were attempts to measure aspects of lived experience in the absence of access to interviewees. Pieces were selected if they related to the natural world, and a set of themes was developed for each type of source. I recorded quantitative counts on the prevalence, as well as qualitative notes on the application of these themes. As a white person approaching this literature, I really had to think about my position in coding and analysis, which I'm happy to elaborate on in Q&A. So these are my results for the tribal news themes. First of all, I want to talk about these two, colonization and climate change. They were both lower than expected, but that's likely due to the fact that tribal news primarily focuses on current and local issues. Next, we have environmental preservation, which, as you can see here, was high in both regions as expected. And as you can see in this example quote, pieces with this theme highlighted both positive and negative human intervention. So here the influence of reciprocity and relationality was clear, as human responsibility and stewardship were highlighted in these pieces. Next, we have environmental destruction. Several articles here in this theme talked about degradation as a result of Western land management strategies and capitalistic ventures. There was some difference in application, though in the Northwest Coast, these articles tend to mention a specific event and its impact on ecosystems which support native livelihoods. However, in the Plains, this theme was related more clearly to Indigenous sovereignty, and as you can see here, was more prevalent in that region. This could be an example of regional environmental pressures affecting conceptualization of environmental degradation. Whereas in the Plains, destruction of sacred sites threatens sovereignty and spirituality, it's discussed as an attack on these. In the Northwest Coast, where poisoned rivers and declining fish populations threaten ways of life, environmental destruction is discussed as an attack on physical and economic livelihoods. Next, we have local flora and fauna. This theme measured the importance of place in discussion of current environmental events. It's applied the same in both regions, but as you can see here, was much more prevalent in the Northwest Coast, which is yet another potential impact of regional histories. One potential explanation is that in the Northwest Coast, destruction more directly threatens local flora and fauna, whereas in the Plains, environmental destruction threatens land and sacred sites. It's also possible that more severe removal policies within the Plains reduced focus on local wildlife and traditional foods in this region. Next, we have water and land. And these are interesting themes, interesting results, because I had expected a higher focus on water in the Northwest Coast and a higher focus on land in the Plains. But as you can see, they were pretty similar across regions. In both regions, water was explicitly regarded as vital or sacred, and the responsibility of humans to protect water was assumed or stated. However, water and land were often the focus of the pieces in the Northwest Coast, whereas they were just a quick mention in the Plains. Additionally, specific to the land theme, the Plains focused on land protection, where land is threatened. However, the Northwest Coast focused on land management. And lastly, I want to talk about these three themes together: cultural preservation, indigeneity, and human health. Within the human health theme, both regions tied it explicitly to environmental health, though you can see there are large differences in the prevalence. In the Plains, the articles tend to focus on individual and quantified aspects, with an emphasis on the concrete and modern. So, for example, the economic or medical impacts of environmental events on native livelihoods. In the Northwest Coast, human health themes tend to focus on threats to culture and traditional ways of life. So poor health was often situated within a deviation from tradition, community, or environmental health. We also have this indigeneity theme, which is a measure of the prevalence of discussions on identity and tradition, as you can see in this example quote here. The application was the same across regions and consistent with the literature. The importance of land and animals as sacred, responsibility of Native people as stewards, and the importance of tradition and place-based relational history all came up in this theme in both regions. However, it's very much more prevalent in the Northwest Coast, which indicates that while concepts of tradition and identity might be the same in both regions, they're more ubiquitous in the Northwest Coast. So it's possible that a heightened quantitative emphasis on Native identity and tradition in the Northwest Coast directly contributes to the difference in cultural preservation here, as a greater or more frequent focus on tradition could lead to a greater focus on maintaining cultural practices. Additionally, the greater focus on indigeneity and cultural preservation in the Northwest Coast could lead to less explicit focus on human health, as the connection between human and environmental health might be emphasized more in local culture and then taken for granted when reporting. It's also possible that Western ideologies of individualization and separation of the spiritual and physical had a greater impact in the Plains, potentially due to more severe relocation and assimilation policies, or due to the importance of Western science and political action and sovereignty in that region, for example, when fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline. So the regional differences in these three themes paint a picture of cultural difference in the role of tradition and health and environmental issues, and demonstrate the need for further research on this. Next, we've got the legends themes. And first I want to talk about these two, non-human relations and place-based, which as you can see are very high in both regions. These two themes are vital in the creation and maintenance of Indigenous relationships in the natural world, because they form the basis for the important elements of relationality in place, creating an intimate tie between people and nature. Assuming these legends are told the same way today, the prevalence of these themes could foster deep spiritual and generational ties to place, as non-human relatives are regarded as sentient actors and knowledge of place is reinforced with histories and narratives revolving around local landscapes and species. However, I should mention there is some difference in the application of place-based between the two regions, as it applied only to animals in the plains, but to animals and landmarks in the Northwest coast. This could be due again to displacement policies or simply due to the fact that the plains region had more historically nomadic cultures. So animals might have mattered more in connecting to place than landmarks in these legends. Next, we have individual action, and the high prevalence of this one might appear initially strange, especially compared to community action, in a culture that places a really high emphasis on reciprocity and relationality. However, even when individual action was the focus of a legend, like in this quote here, actions were nested within the community, and actions contrary to the community were often punished. So this maintains the importance of action without diminishing the importance of relations, and might contribute to the important balance between reciprocity and consensual participation, maintaining responsibility without diminishing individual choice. And lastly, I want to talk about these four themes, which you can see vary quite a bit across regions. All of them have quantitative differences, and that's due to trends in a type of story in each region. In the Pacific Northwest, there was a greater focus on proactive transformation. So non-human beings might change the land or people to fit a set of anticipated needs, therefore human and land transformation. However, in the plains, there was a greater focus on problem-solving gifts. So for example, beings would respond to human starvation or struggle by giving them gifts for survival. So here we see the higher rates of gift giving and human well-being. Now, when considering this difference, I do want to note that there was a very small sample size in the plains, about half that of the Northwest coast, and also that these legends were recorded by non-Indigenous people, meaning that there is a potential bias in recording these. However, all we can really say here is that we need more research and firsthand sources to investigate some of the trends found in this study. So ultimately, even though the prevalence and application might vary across region, this study did confirm that several aspects of the previously observed native relationship to the natural world were present at a regional level, including reciprocity, land and animals as sacred, stewardship of nature, kinship, intimacy, and tradition as a vehicle to uphold all of these. However, we also saw that the actual prevalence and application of these aspects was not the same across regions. Native relationship to the natural world could be impacted by place, regional cultures, modern pressures, and history. So while this study can only theorize as to the reasons behind that difference, it can confirm that there is significant fault in assuming homogeneity, and that future research should embrace and explore diversity. This thesis contributes to the conversation on Indigenous sociology by confirming the literature gap through demonstration of trends and regional difference in both storytelling and coverage of current events, identifying key aspects of a unique, empathetic, and reciprocal relationship between Native peoples and the environment at the regional level. And this research provides a basis for future research by identifying potential points of difference through secondhand sources. However, this research also exists within a worldwide context of Western hegemony and climate change. These findings can combat Western ideology by investigating the nuances of a relationship that is in many ways the antithesis to Western domination and disconnection from the natural world. Additionally, studies like this promote Native voices by demonstrating the existence of problematic gaps in the literature and calling for more diverse and holistic research in the future. And lastly, my research shows the importance of application rather than simply acknowledgement. Prior literature acknowledged, but did not apply, the importance of diverse regional histories and cultures. And by doing so, it ignored a vital aspect, context, and place of the culture which it studied, and thus undermined and contradicted itself. And this is a trend present outside just scientific literature. We have to move towards understanding, incorporating, and amplifying Indigenous science and perspectives, rather than simply acknowledging them. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to seeing your questions and feedback in the comments and in the Q&A session.